So all the water goes into aquifers underneath, and it actually seeps out to sea slowly over time. That water's sitting there as fresh water and available for use. Our concern is that we believe we've got the opportunity to grow and create regional-based cities in areas like the West Coast, and there's places along on the Queensland coast that have similar attributes. And it never seems to get on the debate. It always seems to be about why Melbourne and Sydney are full. And they might well be, but there is other parts to Australia that could actually sustain that population growth, and sustainably. I think we could actually create cities that would be the envy of the world in the context of livability, well planned, and being completely carbon neutral.
Thank you. It's an incredibly important question as to whether we should be thinking about, whether there are new cities that should be created. And thinking about this question recently, I was also noticing Keating and Fraser's recent comments that we're perhaps afraid because the one city that we have kind of created from scratch in Australia is Canberra. So the gentleman with the white shirt up the back.
David DeVoe from the University of Queensland. Bernard, I accept your proposition that increasing the retirement age or participating in the labour force for longer isn't going to make much difference. I think you're right, we'll just squeeze a little more out of it. One of the things I think, though, that we need to do to balance that with is one of the reasons why I think we are facing some labour force shortages and skills shortages in the future are participation rates. And I think that there is something that we can do to deal with participation rates of our current workforce and the barriers to participation. And there, clearly, female participation rate in the labour force has been a really important source of growth of labour, but many important barriers remain. So I think that's one thing that we can do. That's not just an immigration response. The other thing, and the point you make about the shrinking taxation base, I think is a valid point. We should temper that, of course, by the fact that, of course, only a proportion of government's income is from income tax, and you're talking about a shrinking, I think, of the income tax base. What I should think we will get over the next few years, of course, are increases in productivity. So those productivity increases have the opportunity to counterbalance some of that decrease in tax base from a smaller labour force. So I think the points that you make are valid ones, but I think they need to be tempered with it's not quite so much an either-or proposition, in my view.
Do you want a quick response, and then I'll come back to
the
question you posed?
Yes, I agree on the participation rates. I think we need to do that. I think we need to engage the Indigenous community more. This is my point. If we've got an issue here, the easy response is, I'll just draw up the drawbridge. That will solve all our problems. The congestion on the roads in Sydney, the congestions in Melbourne, will all disappear if we draw. No, I don't think so. That goes back to city planning decisions that were made 10, 15 years ago. Participation rates. I'd love to see participation rates leveraged up for women, for Indigenous communities, for people aged between 55 and 74. I think that is something that we can work on in the future. The income, the tax base at the moment, we generate about $1,000 billion a year. That's how much. That's the total GDP of the country. About $300 billion a year is the tax base. About 30%. 30% from income, GST, company tax, all that. If you go to France or to Denmark or to Germany, that proportion is around 44 to 48%. My view is, yes, we will be dragging more people in, and yes, you will be paying more tax. And it still is not going to be enough by the early years of the 2020s. So just dragging people in is not going to solve it. You will be paying more tax, and we will need more taxpayers. Just on this, we've only created one new city. We've actually created two. The other one is the Gold Coast, and it's twice the size of Canberra. Whether, in fact, it's successful or not is another issue.
No, sorry. I'm sorry. I just can never resist a jab at Canberra at any opportunity.
Okay.
We'll go back to a question. So taking into account Hugh Morgan's point and your own point about kind of creating new cities in Geraldton, and Bernard's question about, well, how much control over this do we have, and what is it that we would do?
It's a bit like the teddy bear's picnic. All the old shibboleths have come out to play, even the notion that this is a vast, empty country. Land without people for people without land. It's rubbish. It's a semi-arid, semi-desert continent. And all the parts that are arable are already being used. As to how much food we could produce and how many people we could support, it depends whether we can continue to have cheap oil-based fertilisers. Fertilisers are made from oil or natural gas. When the price of oil hit $100 a barrel, food riots broke out around the world because even the third world relies on nitrate fertilisers to grow. It's the likelihood that we'll be extremely strained for these because we'll have used up all our own oil by 2020, as the third intergenerational report reports, that causes Tim Flannery to suggest that our future carrying capacity could be as low as 12 million or even less. You know, we are in dangerous, uncharted territories in pushing the population ever higher. So arguing that you'd have a nicer balance of the generations, you know, it's like saying, let's load more people into this leaking boat because they're such good workers, or I like him, or we haven't got enough people of this sort or that. You've got to first ask, what's the carrying capacity of the country? Where do we go with this notion that the old are such a burden? They're not. A study by the Australia Institute showed that the old are a source of money to the younger generations, at least up to the age of 75. Whereas I can assure you that almost everyone under the age of 20 is sucking in money. The young are very expensive health costs. It's a myth that the blowout that's said to be coming in health costs is due to there being more old people. In fact, it's largely because the Treasurer is planning to push up the population by 60%. That's right, the cause of the blowout is the supposed remedy, having more people. As naive as that is the thinking. What were the other shibboleths around?
How are you going to stop population growth then?
It's not so difficult. As Bernard says, natural increase has been very high in Australia, despite all the lies that have been told about how births weren't keeping up with deaths. Births in Australia are twice deaths, and they have been so for 20 years. But they won't continue indefinitely, because if women go on averaging 2 children, eventually the generations become even-sized and one generation replaces another. So it is not so difficult as people make out to stabilise our population. Natural increase, and I'm not proposing to influence people's free choices, obviously, but we should not be paying them baby bonuses or keeping up a pro-natalist rhetoric as if it's something you're giving to your country by having a large family, but just letting people have the number of children they want. Natural increase is not going to be a large problem. It will taper off quite quickly, and on differing projections, quite sensitive to what you think the fertility rate will be, they'll add 1 or 2 million, perhaps even 3 million more people. But any very large future growth in Australia is a voluntary one by bringing in further immigrants. As to the notion that we can actually take off the overpopulation of the rest of the world, it's an absolute myth. Australia is a small country in carrying capacity. China and India are vast, rich countries. That's how they got their vast populations. And the number that we could take off, even if we said we will only concentrate on India and help India, what if we could take 1 million people a year from India? It would make no difference. Indeed, it would only help the Conservatives in that country to say, oh, there's an empty country, you know, don't worry. We can't do anything useful. Conversely, the military argument that some people put up, one of these countries will go rogue, defy the international community, start a new colonial age, and take over Australia on the grounds that they have a lot of people and they need more land. If China did that, let's say, how many Chinese could it push into a devastated Australia to take the pressure off itself? 500,000, 1 million? They wouldn't feel the difference. There would be no such value in it as people imagine. As to the moral argument, yes, refugees, but refugees are a trivial percentage of our immigrant intake. We take in 4,000 to 6,000 UN definition refugees a year, and the total humanitarian intake, where being kind to the person chosen is a major part of their choice, is 13,000 to 14,000. Now that's in a gross intake up around the 300,000 a year. So we could double refugees, as indeed the Anglican Church recently recommended, while heavily reducing immigration. In fact, I recommend strongly, if you're into the moral issues, the recent statement from the Anglican Church in Australia, a very enlightened statement in which it points out we have a moral obligation to control Australia's future population, that we should not be paying baby bonuses, and that we should be limiting immigration while increasing refugees. The two things are not incompatible.
Thank you. I'm going to take some more contributions from the audience. So a gentleman in the middle at the back, and then a lady. It would be
Derek
lovely
Van
if I weren't
Dyke,
the only
Industry and
female voice.
Investment in New South Wales. My question goes to the skilled component of the labour force going forward. So as we enter more and more a global economy, it is quite clear that the competition for skills across the globe is increasing. And Mark, to use your point that children or people are staying in education longer, Is this something that we have to protect? So a few years ago, the debate was about a brain drain. It seems that that debate has been overtaken by a diaspora component and the benefits of diaspora. Are we still on diaspora, or are we worried in the future about brain drain?
Yeah. Quick response.
Yeah.
Can you give the microphone to the lead? And you've got one. Excellent, Bernard. Quick response.
There are 23 million Australians on this planet. Only 22 million live in Australia. 5% of this nation now lives overseas. And this is part of the colonial over there is better than back here. It's the view of my son's doing really well, he's in London or in New York. Yeah, right, okay. This is the point of in a global workforce, small colonial outposts like Australia actually tithe their best and brightest to some other country. This is the way I think it will work in the 21st century. A good argument as to why a bigger country actually offers more opportunity is the relationship between Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand, what, 4 million people? 22 million in Australia. If a country like Australia does not provide better opportunity, greater range and depth of job opportunities, then why are there 500,000 New Zealanders in Australia and only 60,000 Australians in New Zealand? The reason is that those Kiwis are over here competing in a bigger, better country because of the depth, scale, range of jobs on offer. And it's why a Macquarie Bank analyst from Sydney will not be in Sydney, they'll be in London, Shanghai, Mumbai, Dubai. That's the way of the world in the 21st century, be a fluid, transient, mobile workforce. And we are in that workforce, in that world to compete for talent and labour in our country as well as conceding talent to other countries. This idea that you can actually put up a barrier and block everyone from coming in just goes completely against what I think, this whole Thomas Friedman flat world that I think we're moving into. So I think we need to manage this, not delude ourselves that we can somehow prevent it in some way. This issue of China, the idea of China invading Australia to colonise Australia, that's never been a proposition. Where has that come from? China doesn't need to invade Australia. 2 aircraft carriers and they could control what they actually need, which is the black coal mines and the iron ore plants. They don't need to settle the Australian continent. They could actually do that in a flick of the switch. Another argument has been well, that's never going to happen because all our allies are going to come to good luck on that one. Americans are going to spend blood on treasure in 2040 coming to Australia to spend American lives to save us, when we have for 40 years put up the shutters and said, sorry, we are very concerned about the fragility of our environment. We're full up, rest of the planet. You die in squalor in 9 billion people. What I think the rest of the world would have every right to say, from Indonesia to China to Malaysia, this is a rich white enclave that is unrealistic. Now, the fact that we know the planet, the country is uninhabitable, that subtlety is lost on Southeast Asians. And in fact, if I was them, I'd say, this is white Australia policy dressed up as green Australia. And I'd be really angry about that, very angry. What I want to see is progressive, managed migration to mitigate risk going forward. I would also like to see new cities. But Broome needs to be a city of 200,000 people and we need a military post there. We need an equivalent of Laverick Barracks in Broome. We have no military representation between Darwin and Perth. And that's because we thought, ain't nothing there. Sorry, the Chinese told us last September they value a patch of dirt there at $43 billion. The Americans allocated $50 billion to invade Iraq. 43, that's one project. They're not going to settle the these are the issues that we are facing in the next 30 or 40 years. And the idea that we can draw up the drawbridge, pretend the rest of the world doesn't matter, and enjoy our pristine environment, I don't think we're going to be given that luxury. We need to be thinking strategically and long term.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to give you a quick voice because I'm keen to get on to the second female voice of the session because we do have the children after all. So a quick response and then...
I'll just quickly note that Bernard's passion causes him to argue in all directions at once. Just in the last minute or two, we've heard him simultaneously argue that invasion of Australia is not a possibility and that it's a distinct possibility and that we wouldn't be rescued by the Americans.
Tell us what you think of the issue.
I don't think. I think the days of invasions are largely over, so long as the world's in its current phase. But if we move into peak oil, then we do have to look out